Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Today, we're going to discuss Chapter 9 in Effective Group Discussion Theory and Practice. Chapter 9 is Problem Solving and Decision Making in Groups, Theoretical Perspectives. And just if you're looking at the book, I'm looking at the ebook here. I'm on page 227. Okay. So, starting off on page 227, as we move on, it gives you the objectives. One of the things that we start off in problem solving and decision making is understanding what a problem is. And a problem is a discrepancy between a current state, what actually is happening, and a desired goal, what should be happening, right? It's like, this is what I want, this is what's happening, and they're not matching up, right? The one is here, and for some reason, it's not the same thing, right? And that's really what the problem is. Now, problem solving is the comprehensive multi-step procedure a group uses to move from its current state to the desired goal. And that's really just a fancy way of saying that, hey, the problem solving process, how we solve the problem, how we get to where we want to go, right, is really the process that we do in a problem solving process. That's how we work together as a team, right? And the decision making refers to the act of choosing among a set of alternatives. Decision making is, what do we do? Do we do this or do we do that? Right? And then you take a step forward. Do we do this or do we do that? Then you take another step forward. And so every single decision, every step that you take leads you to another step in which you have to seek an alternative. Do I do this or I do that? That's the decision-making process as you move forward. Now, groups can achieve an assembly effect in which the decision is qualitatively and quantitatively better than the best individual judgment of members. Now, let's understand this, what qualitative and quantitative means. A lot of you are going to sort of start hearing these two terms as you move on in your academic career, and depending on which sort how should I say, what major you're going to choose, what classes you're going to take. These terms are going to be really important, especially if you start getting into studies. And really, the way that I like to sort of differentiate both is qualitatively. The root word there is quality, and quantitatively, the root word there is quantity. Right. So automatically, when you look at quantity, you're looking at a number, right? Whereas quality, it's almost kind of opinion based, right? So it's like asking someone, do you think you're successful? And they'll say, well, yes. And they'll say, oh, well, why? Well, qualitatively, they may say, well, I feel successful because I'm able to, I'm able to have the weekends off. I'm able to spend time with my family. I'm able to make enough money to support myself, my family, live in a nice area, and drive an okay car. Like, to me, that's success, right? Quantitatively, right? Quantity, I'm talking about numbers. They may say, oh, are you successful? Oh, well, yes, I am. Well, why do you say that? Oh, it's because I make over $150,000 a year. All right. Now, realistically, both responses are correct, right? Depending on the parameters that you achieve for success and in understanding. But it's almost kind of like saying one is based on numbers and facts and figures, and the other one is very much opinion based. I feel, right? I think, right? And so you kind of have to understand what qualitative versus quantitative is as we start moving forward and as you start moving forward in your academic career. Now, let's read that again. So now that we have a better understanding, let's read that again, see if it makes a little bit more sense to you. So groups can achieve an assembly effect in which the decision is qualitatively and quantitatively better than the best individual judgment of the members. What that means is that we make better decisions as a group than we do as individuals, because as a group we can bounce ideas off of each other, and we can kind of figure out what works better because we can have more minds looking at the problem, right? Now, some of the benefits of groups as problem solvers is that the members can compensate each other for each other's weaknesses. So if you have somebody, for example, I'm not great at math, but if I have somebody in my team who is, They might be the ones to be able to interpret math problems, studies, and anything that has to do with numbers far better than I can. So that person can then look at that information and then put it into words in a way that I can understand it better, right? We compensate for each other. By sharing, members give the group a larger pool of information and ideas. We mentioned earlier is because there's a lot more people there, we can go ahead and tap our brains as a group and say, hey, what do you think, or what do you think? And a lot of times, some people may offer ideas that you never even thought about, right? Group members can spot each other's errors, right? We double check our work, and if we look at each other's work, we can say, hey, that's wrong. No, you may want to do this, right? And they provide different perspectives to problems depending on your experiences, your age, your culture, a novel of background. You can see things a little bit differently, and your perspectives could be a lot differently as well. And therefore, you could provide maybe a different scenario, a different solution, a different alternative that other people may not see because they don't share your same perspective, they don't share your same experiences. Now, groups can accomplish more than an individual can, right? It's kind of like, it's funny when I played high school basketball, we had a player who was really good. He was a really good basketball player, and it got to the point one time where in one of our practices where he was taking every single shot, and the rest of the team was running the plays, but nobody else touched the ball. And the coach got frustrated at that and said, "Okay, here, stop the practice. All right, you ready? 5 against 1. All right, go." And that one best player tried to play against the 5 other people on the other team, and guess what? No matter how good he was, the fact that he was going up against 5 other people, it really sort of evened things out for those people who weren't as good. So as individuals, they may not have been as good as that one player, but that one player also, by himself versus 5 wasn't as good as the 5 combined team. So individually, they may not have been as good as the one player, but as a team, they were much better. And obviously, the sort of the point was made that you have to be a team in order to win the game of basketball. It just can't be one star taking every single shot, no matter how good you are. All right. Um, Group involvement in decision making increases acceptance of decision. In other words, the idea that more people agree gives more merit to the idea that you made the right decision. And the groups meet our human needs for belonging and affection, which means that when we start working as a group, we feel like we're part of a team. We feel like we're part of something, and that's very much a human need to feel a part of a group, right? Now, some of the disadvantages of groups as problem solvers, and there are some, groups take up more time to make decisions. And that's kind of true, right? Think of it this way. You want to go get something to eat. You're by yourself and you're like, where do you want to go eat? I want a burger. All right, let's go to McDonald's. And boom, 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 you go. McDonald's. Have 5 people in the car and say, where do you want to eat? All of a sudden, we're like, well, I want tacos. Well, I want burgers. Well, I want this. Well, I want that. And all of a sudden, the decision making process, takes a little bit longer. Now, you may arrive to a decision and say, hey, yeah, okay, fine, let's go eat. But it's still a lot more time than one individual just making the decision and saying, okay, I want to eat there and I'll just go there because I don't need anybody else's approval to do that. Sometimes group members can experience pressures to conform. Sometimes when you have 7 people and one person out of the 7 is sort of the dissenting voice, the 6 other ones can pressure that one person to finally say, well, okay, fine, I'll do it because everybody else is doing it. Even though reluctantly they may do it, in the back of their mind, they might be saying, no, I know it's wrong. Why don't they see it? Right? So sometimes you're forced to conform to the group, even though it may not be the decision that you would agree with. And then when the group process goes badly, relationships among members can become strained. And that basically means that if decisions are made that don't come with success, if certain things are done where you don't reach your desired goal, all of a sudden you start pointing fingers. No, it's their fault. No, it's your fault. She did it. He did it. And all of a sudden, relationships can be very strained. And you start pointing fingers. You start getting mad. And whatever happened to that team unity that we had before. Now, there's 3 factors influencing the decision-making process. The full participation of all group members and the most influential factor includes such behaviors as encouraging members to contribute, to disagree, and to elaborate on their suggestions, right? And really, the idea is you need everybody to come in. It's okay to argue. It's okay to have conflict. It's okay to have different ideas because it's through that debate, through that conflict, that you're able to move forward. But you'll never have conflict if everybody just sort of agrees and goes along. Everybody should have an opportunity to contribute and express their ideas. And in some cases, they're going to fall in line together and everybody's going to be on the same page, and that's great. And sometimes they're not. And you know what? That's great too. Even though it might take longer to get to the right decision as a team, it's still that process that's the learning that's sort of the journey of learning, and where you all as a team learn something new. There's negative social emotional behaviors like being sarcastic, expressing dislike, and personal attacks that hurt decision making, right? A lot of times what happens is, um, as you start disagreeing with each other, you start misbehaving, right? You start having personal attack. All of a sudden, I disagree with you, and well, you make dumb decisions in the past, so this one has to be dumb too. Or, well, look at the car you drive. I mean, how could you possibly know whether or not a Tesla's a good car if you're driving around in an old beat up truck? They're like, wait, what does driving a truck have to do with my knowledge about Tesla, right? All of a sudden, these personal attacks that really have nothing to do with the question at hand or the problem that we're trying to solve, those behaviors can sometimes impact, obviously, negative behaviors can impact the group. And then positive social emotional behaviors are more respective and support each other and really in line to improve as you move forward. Okay? There's the functional perspective, and the functional perspective states that the communicative actions of group members determine decision making and problem solving performance. What does that mean when we get into the functional perspective states? Well, one of the things that we want to do is that we have to understand um, the actions that go forth in making these decisions, whether they're good or they're bad. But how do we do them as a team, and how do we bring them together as individuals, where then it then becomes a team decision? So if we're looking at page 233, it actually gives you a really good explanation of the functional perspective. And it basically states that group members are motivated to make the best choice possible. The choice isn't obvious. They have access to the information and other resources they need, and they have the cognitive ability and communication skills necessary for the task. And it really gives you an understanding of what it is. It actually gives you 5 steps here, that the group performs, in 5 fundamental task requirements in order to reach that decision. The first one is group members must understand the issue to be resolved, right? What is it that we're trying to fix? What's the problem? Members must determine what minimal characteristics or acceptable alternatives must have, right? What's the minimum requirements? What is it that you need to accomplish? And if you're trying to figure out a way to make $1 million, but the decisions you're making, only make you $500,000, are you happy with that? Is that the minimum, right? So what are the minimum requirements that in these outcomes? They must determine what those relevant and realistic alternatives are, and they must carefully examine those alternatives against the previously determined characteristics necessary for the acceptable choice. In other words, you start needed comparing what you think you should do with what you were doing before or what the other alternatives were, and making sure that, yeah, it is better than this one. Right? And then lastly, number 5, they must select the alternative that seems most likely to have the characteristics needed. In other words, make the choice that seemingly is going to get you to where you want to go. Okay? Okay, so here are the fundamentals here. Um, Group members understand the issue. They must determine the minimal characteristic. Um, as we move forward here, they must examine alternatives against the previously determined characteristics necessary for an acceptable choice. And here, number 5, they must select the alternative that most seems likely to have the characteristics needed. All right, cool. We got it right here too. Nice. All right. So the charge is the assignment given to the group. You are charged with solving this problem, right? So think of a charge as sort of the sort of the what you've been appointed to do. What is the task that has been given to you, right? And the group's area of freedom is the amount of authority and limitations that it has, right? So think of it, think of the idea, let's say you're at work and at work we're facing the problem of low morale. And so your boss, the CEO of the company or the manager, the owner, whatever, says it gives you and four other people, so you're a group of five, says, we have low morale. So you need to figure out a way to boost up morale, right? And so you get together as a group and you decide as a group, like, hey, you know what? We're gonna have a Christmas party. We never have one. A Christmas party is awesome, or a holiday party, or a summer party, a Thanksgiving party, whatever. You decide that you're gonna have a get together as a group that's outside of the norm, right? Now, the group's area of freedom is the amount of authority and limitations that it has. So, as an example, the boss may say, hey, all right, fine, you can do this, but A, it has to be on a Saturday. B, you can only spend $500. And C, it can't conflict with normal time of operations of the company. All right. Well, all of a sudden, you've been given a limit as to the freedom. You can't just say, oh, yeah, we're going to do it on a Monday and we're going to spend $5,000 and we're going to do it. We're going to all go bowling at lunchtime. Well, if Monday's a regular work day, that's not going to fit. So all of a sudden, this area of freedom is really determining what decisions you're going to make. Now, so four common question types that you need to consider here is a question of fact asks whether something is true or actually happened, right? So when you're talking about common question types, these are things that sort of question what's going on, right? A question of fact is something is whether is true or actually happened, right? It's a fact, right? A question of conjecture is ask a group to speculate or make an educated guess about something. You're not sure, but you're gonna take a guess. Well, I think we're doing well. It should turn out to be this. It can be that. Well, based on the research, based on what we know, based on sort of the studies, we think it's gonna be this, right? So all of a sudden, it's an educated guess. That's what conjecture means. Okay, a question of value refers to what is right, good, preferable, or acceptable. Now, when you're talking about value, think of like your own values, right? A lot of times the values of society sort of align in masses, right? The idea of thou shalt not kill, for example, is a value. It's a law, but it's a value that most cultures throughout the world sort of have, that they don't that they value life, right? So thou shalt not murder, sort of a value that most people have instituted into law, right? But there's other values that people sort of carry on within themselves, and it isn't necessarily tied into law, right? So as an example, um, your value may state that you should not cuss at somebody else, but there really isn't a law against it, depending on the circumstances, of course. But if people say, well, it's the freedom of speech. Well, does the freedom of speech mean that you get to say whatever you want? Well, it does legally, but value-wise, do we prefer it? Is it right? Right? And the term right really is sort of tricky there, because what's right to some people may not be right for others, right? So that's always something to consider here. And then a question of policy is really ask a course of action that a group will take. And we're talking about policy. Think of the idea of a law, a guideline, a a rule, right? And we're all governed by rules, guidelines, and laws. There's nothing that goes on within your life that probably is not effective by a rule or a guideline, right? When you drive, the minute you get in your car and you start driving, you're full of laws and rules that you have to follow. Using a signal light, stopping at a red light. When you get to a stop sign, the person on your right goes first. If you get there, those are all rules and guidelines that you adhere to. Some policies, some rules are outdated, need to be changed. Um, need to be need to be changed because they're outdated and they really don't reflect what's going on in society now, or really sometimes new policies that need to be in place because they didn't exist before, and we have new technology. So as an example, as we start looking at technology and how technology evolves and people's use of technology, all of a sudden these new laws have to be created, these new policies need to be created in order to solve some of the problems that technology gives you, right? Whether it's cyberbullying, whether it's cyber stalking, those are new laws that are now in place that weren't in place before. Now, there are four common ways that groups make decisions. Okay, you have a decision by the leader, and that usually is a common way of doing things. Think of like a CEO of a company, a manager that just decides, hey, we're going to do it this way, right? There's a decision by leader with consultation, and that's a decision where the leader has the final decision, but before they actually give you that decision, they consult some of the members for advice, and based on some of the advice that they get, they will then come out with a decision. There's decision by majority vote, and that's really kind of the most common one, really, because most teams will they'll do is at the end when they reach a point where not everybody agrees, they'll say, all right, well, put your hands up if you want to do this, and 3 to 5, okay, we're gonna move forward. And sometimes you got to do that just to go, because you're sort of just there arguing that you're never taking a step forward, and sometimes you just got to move forward. And then you have the decision by consensus, and the decision by consensus is the idea that everybody has to agree. 100% everybody has to be on board with it, and if they're not, we don't move forward, right? So these decisions and how these decisions are made are important because they could determine the steps and sometimes the time that it takes for teams to make a certain decision and move forward. And also consider that there are some things, for example, that are left to the leader that make sense to the leader, right? So let's just say that it's the leader's job to pick a meeting date and time, and to make sure that there's certain beverages at the meeting. You know, there may be a consensus as to when and what time, but do you really want to sit down and argue whether or not he's going to bring Sprite or 7 Up or water or Coke or whatever, right? So some decisions are sometimes better left to the leader just because you want them to move forward quicker. And sometimes, yeah, it does require everybody to be on board, because if everybody can't make to the meeting, then why are you having the meeting, right? Now, there's a couple of things here when it comes to Fisher's model of group phases, right? And this is really the steps, according to Fisher, of how we move from step to step according to according to sort of the process and the journey of a group. And it starts with orientation, and then conflict, and then decision emergence, and then reinforcement. So um, in critical thinking is the systematic examination of information and ideas on the basis of evidence and logic rather than intuition, hunch, or prejudgment, right? So critical thinking is really taking the information and just thinking to yourself, okay, that makes sense. No, no, that you ever see something on TV and it just didn't make sense to you, and you're like, no, that has to be wrong, that makes no sense to me one bit, as to as to how they got what they got. No, 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 it's like seeing a magic trick, right? It's like, no, no, that doesn't make any sense, right? And then in evaluating information, you want to make sure you distinguish between facts and inferences. You want to make sure you evaluate survey and statistical data, and you want to evaluate the sources and implications of opinions, right? And all of these are extremely important. The idea being that that you want to be able to give the right information or the right opinion based on the right information. Because the minute that the information that you get, the resources that you used were false or misleading, all of a sudden your information or your opinion becomes false and misleading. So it's really important that all the information you use, all the data, all the sources, all the facts, everything is sort of used and understood as to whether it's a fact or it's inferred, right? Where's the data? Where's it coming from? How did they ascertain the data, right? And then in the sources that you're using, are they opinion based? And if it's opinion based, how did they arrive to their opinion? Now, evaluating reasoning. Now, valid reasoning connects information with appropriate conclusions in an appropriate and defensible way. So really, when you're talking about valid reasoning, it really is the idea that if I see this and if I see this, and they're both exactly the same, that means that they're likely to be what? The same. If I do this here and I do this here and I get the same results, then it may be the same thing. Now, that's a very sort of loose example there, but the idea is I'm using my reasoning. I'm using my brain into thinking, um, okay, I can see this and I can see that, and there's similarities, so maybe they're what? They're the same, right? Or I see this and I see that, and they're very different, so therefore they must not be related, right? That's just reasoning. That's just taking some information and just using your brain and saying, well, it makes sense that they're tied together, or it makes sense that they're not. Okay. Now, some of the things that we have to be careful about are fallacies, and we need to stop fallacies. And fallacies are really sort of coming to prejudgment or pre-ideas where it doesn't make sense to do so. That just because it happens here doesn't mean it's going to happen there, right? So some of the five common fallacies observed in group discussions are called overgeneralization, ad hominem, suggesting inappropriate causal relationships, false dilemmas, and faulty analogies, right? And each and every single one of these are sort of unique onto their own. I'm not going to explain every single one because I think it's important that you go in there and you sort of learn what they are. But just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, overgeneralizing here is really that the idea of um, everybody's doing it, right? And sometimes you'll see that with politicians, for example. Americans want to see us do this, and you kind of stand back and say, well, I'm an American and I don't want to do that. So when you say all Americans, who exactly are you referring to, right? And so that's over generalizing, and that doesn't make any sense sometimes. It really doesn't. And then when we get to ad hominem attacks, and just so you know, I paused it real quick to find the page. We're on page 245, okay? And ad hominem attacks, you're actually looking at the idea that instead of attacking the problem or attacking the argument, you're attacking the person, right? That person could give you the best answer in the world, but because you disagree, but you can't find a way to attack sort of what the argument is, what do? You attack the person. Well, no, 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 that must be wrong because he has a history of making bad decisions, and no, he's just incorrect in so many things. And you're like, well, okay, maybe he does, or maybe he does have sort of a bad history, or maybe he has done this, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about now? Right? So that's sort of the ad hominem there. Suggesting inappropriate causal relationships, that just because this is sometimes it's funny. I hear sometimes, oh, in the summer, you hear someone say, oh, this is earthquake weather, as if they're putting it out there that because it's hot in summer, more earthquakes are bound to happen. That's not necessarily true. I haven't seen, and nothing's been pointed out. And I've had students that have been geology majors, and really nothing's been pointed out to me. And I could be wrong, that hot weather equals the more likelihood of earthquakes. So you can't sort of put one and have it say it causes the other. Just because an earthquake may have happened in the summer doesn't mean that the summer causes earthquakes. right? When we get to false dilemmas, it says it poses an either or choice that implies wrongly that only two courses of actions are possible. So you know, it's like saying, well, you're either going to do this or you're going to do that, and no, that's not the case. Sometimes there's multiple solutions. We had a situation here in the city of Rancho Cucamonga where they have this new piece of land in northern Rancho that they want to build on it. And so one of the questions that was asked was, well, would you rather see more shopping centers, or would you rather see more entertainment centers like movie theaters and stuff? And really, what it seems like they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of gear that area towards more sort of retail and tax sort of driven businesses, whereas opposed to say where the as opposed to offering more choices, like, well, would you rather have shopping centers? Would you rather have more entertainment, or would you rather just see more homes? Would you rather see more equestrian areas? Would you rather see more parks? Um, and so it really is sort of that question of a false dilemma, saying it's one or the other when really there's more choices than just two. And then the faulty analogies is it's a comparison that stretches a similarity too far. And it's really the idea that sometimes you could compare one thing to the other to kind of say, oh yeah, oh okay, I see what you mean. You know, comparing sort of this job to this job is yeah, I see that. So for example, somebody might say, well, you know, if you could ride a bike, you could ride a motorcycle. You know, it's the same thing. Well, if you've ever ridden a motorcycle and if you've ever ridden a bike, some of you may be out there saying it is not the same thing, right? I ride bikes and I've ridden a motorcycle. And I can tell you that as balanced as I was, as somewhat of an athlete that I was, it's not the same thing. You're dealing with such a different thing that, yes, the analogy could be the same that they both have two wheels, they both have handlebars, and they both sort of push forward, and you sort of have to balance yourself. Yeah, that's an analogy that you could say. But to say that one it's easy to ride because that the motorcycle is easy to ride because if you can ride this, you can ride that. Man, that's stretched really thin, and that might be considered a faulty analogy. Um, so, in evaluating information and reasoning from the World Wide Web, right? A lot of us get our information from the World Wide Web. A lot of us get our information from from what we find on our website. And it's really interesting what we can find. And especially the way algorithms and the way search engines work. You know, a lot of times the engine will be fed to you based on the way you ask the question or on your previous sort of history of asking the same question, but it doesn't necessarily make it true, right? And we have to be careful about those things. So as we get information online, as we do searches, a couple of things that we have to worry about or that we should consider ourselves are one with its accuracy. How accurate is information? Is it accurate? Is it faulty? Are the numbers misrepresented? How accurate is it? It's sort of all encompassing when it comes to the factual versus opinion. Authority. Where are you getting the information from? What authority do they have? You know, seemingly anybody can write about anything and put it online. That doesn't necessarily make it right or correct. Who's the audience? Who's it meant for? You know, whoever wrote it or whoever put the information up or what organization put the information up, they put it up there for somebody to read. Who was their target audience? What was their purpose? What was the purpose of them putting this up there to begin with? Were they trying to inform? Were they trying to persuade? What are they trying to do? Recency is how old is it? You know, a lot of times, especially with modern technology articles, you want to put information out. You want to use information that's at least 2 years old because beyond anything beyond that, especially as technology goes, it's almost outdated. And the things you got to look at, just look at your cell phones. Look at your cell phones today to cell phones of 5 years ago. There's probably been, like if you look at the iPhone, there's probably been about 3 or 4 iPhones within a span of 5 years, and that technology has changed. So if you're writing sort of a an article or you're providing information on cell phones and you want to use Apple iPhones as an example, you're probably going to go with the 11, and you're not going to touch the 6 or the 7. It's just too old, right? So same thing is, a lot of the articles you want to make sure that they're young enough for you to be able to use appropriately. Now, with that being said, there is some information and some data that you can use from history that's, maybe some time ago, especially if you're writing sort of the evolution of information or the evolution of a product. So if you want to talk about cell phones and you want to talk about where we were and where we are today, then yeah, you may want to look at old stuff, old articles that are out there to sort of see the journey of cell phones. But if you're going to write something that's recent, you have to look at stuff that's been out there recently. Probably no more than 2 years, definitely no more than 5 years. Anything beyond that, it becomes sort of historical. So just be careful about that as you start moving into your sources that are more than 5 years old. And then coverage, how broad is the coverage of this specific article? Who put it out? Is it broad or is it very specific and very narrow as to where it's put out? Can you find that article in a lot of places, or is it just in a single sort of website that's out there somewhere and nobody else can see it? And if nobody else can see it, and if it's just out there, we're just sitting there, it may not have the same coverage. And if it doesn't have the same coverage, that should kind of tell you something. Okay. Now, there's three phenomena that pose problems for effective decision making: hidden profiles, group polarization, and groupthink. Now, hidden profiles really goes under the idea that someone's in it for their own personal gain. It's really someone who's hiding their bias to themselves and not looking at it from the perspective of team first. Okay. Group polarization is the idea that all of a sudden people start separating, right, into this, to us and them, right? And all of a sudden they don't start. So one group turned into sort of two groups that are just always opposing each other. So that's always sort of a problem there. And then you got the issue of groupthink. And we've talked about groupthink before. And really, groupthink is the idea that the leader or someone of authority may say something, and they have so much power, so much authority that nobody will ever think about sort of going against them. So they'll just agree to go along, right? So if the CEO says, "Oh, I think we should do this," everybody's like, "Oh yeah, 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 great idea. Let's do that. Let's do that." And it really doesn't allow for other ideas to come to the table. Um, so in summary, so we talked about problem solving and decision making, the need for structure in the group in order to solve a particular problem. You want to start out right by addressing the charge, the type of question, and the critique. How do we, what is it that we want to do? How do we approach it? And how can we be critical about the information that we use in order to get there? Understand how the group's decision will be made, and then promote critical thinking, understanding what can go wrong, and what are the things that can go wrong during the decision making process so that we can actually avoid them. And then one thing I wanted to do before we move forward is I kind of realized that I touched on sort of uh, Fisher's model of the process of the group, and I really didn't get into those phases. So let me touch on that before we leave, and that's going to be on page 239. So the four phases there are orientation, conflict, decision emergence, and reinforcement. And just real quick, orientation is just really the idea that that's when you all sort of meet and you all get to know each other, right? And that's kind of the term orientation as a whole, is we start getting to know each other. Conflict is basically the idea that as we try to solve the problem, a lot of people are bringing different ideas to the table, and sometimes there's conflict. Again, that's not a bad thing. The fact that you're actually disagreeing means that you're actually talking to each other. That's a good thing, right? Decision emergence is basically the idea that as you come up with different ideas, all of a sudden in the conflict phase, you negotiate, you talk, you compromise, and all of a sudden one decision emerges out of that conflict. And then reinforcement is really the idea that you look at how that decision works, if it's working, and you reinforce that decision that, yeah, we made the right decision. Because if you see that it's not working, all of a sudden you need to start putting your brakes on it and start saying, hey, we need to reevaluate this. Okay, so I'm sorry, I just went through it and I just realized I didn't really touch on those four phases of Fisher's model. So I apologize for that. Anyways, So that is chapter 9. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions whatsoever, you're always welcome to email me. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.